Welcome to GRC Solutions. Today's interview is with Richard Bistrong. This interview came about following a boardroom session that was held here in our Australian offices in Sydney, Melbourne and Perth, where we took the opportunity to introduce Richard to the Australian business community. Richard has spent much of his career in the defence sector, travelling for over 250 days a year for approximately 10 years. He worked through up until 2007 when he was targeted by the US Department of Justice in an investigation on a UN supply contract and was terminated by his employer. Today's interview is with Jane Ellis, who is a senior lawyer, recently the Principal of Assertia, an organisation that was helping companies in Australia with bribery and corruption issues. Jane is now moving to London to take up a role as Director of Legal Projects with the International Bar Association. So I'm sure you'll enjoy this interview. We found the boardroom session very enlightening. Welcome to GRC.
Thank you, Julian, and hello, Richard. I trust you're well. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you again. Richard,
nice to see you again, Jane. Thank you.
Pleasure. Richard, I thought we might start with getting an understanding of your background, who you are, what your education was, and what your career was up until the point of where you were caught having paid bribes.
Sure, Jane. I grew up in the New York City area, not too far from where I'm speaking today, and was educated in upstate New York at the University of Rochester, where I pursued a very strong academic interest in foreign policy. In fact, after finishing undergraduate school, I continued on to what was going to be a PhD degree in foreign policy at the Woodrow Wilson School at the University of Virginia. And right about at the time when I was going to pick up my master's degree along that process, sort of came to a fork in the road. I was offered a White House fellowship in the Reagan administration, so I'm sort of dating my age there. And at the same time, I received a call from my father and my cousin about coming into what was a third generation family business in the aerospace and defense business. And I would be the fourth generation to then enter that business, which had a very strong appeal to me, as I'm sure you can imagine. So in 1987, with a master's degree in foreign policy, I went into my family business, which was a manufacturer of bullet-resistant products, vests, plates, and helmets, and started my trajectory in the aerospace and defense business. So and the next chapter of that started in 1992. We sold that fourth generation family business, and that, Jane, then found me a few years later not wanting to be a non-family member in what was a former family business. So I went ahead and went to work for what was then a competitor. And circa 1998, what was initially, and by way of background, this whole career path was on the sales side. So in my family's enterprise, I was the head of global sales. When I went to work for this company now in 1995, it was the head of U.S. sales and marketing, including U.S. military, U.S. law enforcement. But in 1998, the company was growing dramatically, both organically and through acquisition. And a small sector then of the business was really starting to show promise. And the job opening for the vice president of international sales then presented itself. And Jane, I saw that as a fantastic opportunity to sort of bring in the foreign policy experience and sort of my passion for, international relations, international affairs, and to merge that onto the business side. So in 1998, as Julian referred to, started that 10 years of living overseas. Twice I was posted in the United Kingdom, and traveling on average of 250 days a year, pretty much spread out through all regions in the globe. So that was the beginning of my sales experience on the international side.
Richard, it sounds like a fascinating career, and it's one obviously that was very important to you. So when did it all start to unravel? What happened as part of that, as part of your career expansion that resulted in you being identified as somebody who had been paying bribes to secure contracts?
Well, you know, my exposure to foreign corruption and bribery started quite early, Jane. And as I'm sure you can imagine, in the defense sector, who are your customers? Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defense. So 100% of your touch points are ultimately foreign officials. And very early on, what I started becoming witness to and participating in were discussions of corruption. But as I shared at our boardroom meeting, my initial confrontation, I was nodding my way through breaking the law. In other words, Jane, agents, intermediaries were sharing with me in words that did not involve the word bribe. They were sharing with me in other colorful words how they were paying bribes to win contracts. And Jane, they weren't asking me for anything. Their success fees, their commissions were already negotiated. They were just sharing that as part of their winning strategy, they were paying bribes big and small. So there was a lot of small bribery, but I heard talk of, you know, bribes at the minister and ministry level as well. And as I shared, they weren't asking for anything. So I was just, you know, nodding my way as a co-conspirator early on. So that years later, Jane, when more direct requests came to my attention, where it required more than me just nodding to participate in bribery schemes, I wasn't somehow shocked by the whole experience. I had already sort of crossed that bridge, so to speak, understood this was part of doing business. This is how I rationalized it. And just to be clear, I'm not justifying it because I knew it was illegal when I did it. I had signed enough FCPA provisions and affidavits to know that paying a foreign official or conspiring to was against the law. So there was sort of a trajectory of passive acknowledgement at the beginning, and that then led to more active involvement later on. And ultimately, Jane, that finished in 2007 when I became the subject first of a United Nations investigation that was an offshoot of the oil for food investigations that were occurring through the third party. And as a result of that initial UN investigation, I became subject of a internal investigation on the behalf of my employer. Also, there was a cross section of a whistleblower as well, and I was dismissed as a result of that investigation by my former employer. And this was going into early first quarter 2007, and by the second quarter, found me in June of 2007 proffering with the Justice Department, as in April or May, they contacted my attorney and said I was the subject of a DOJ investigation.
That must have been quite intimidating at that time. What's going through your mind at the time? And did you look at what behavior you'd been engaging in over that up until that point of time, and did you try and rationalize it to yourself? Did you think you'd ever get caught?
You know, Jane, as we talked about in our board discussion, again, not using justification, but there were a number of different ways that I rationalized that behavior. In fact, I referred to it as my perfect storm of rationalizing bribery. Certainly one of those main clouds, so to speak, was the fact that when the talk turns to bribery, there are no witnesses. It's just usually, well, I'll speak in the first person, it was me and the third party in very remote places of the world, including, Tierra del Fuego, which is the bottom of Argentina in a situation that I described. So you're not thinking in these places that you're going to get caught. And you're thinking about compensation, win big, lose big. Most international tenders are large and far and few between, at least in the defense sector. So at the time, I really wasn't spending much time pausing about, am I going to get caught? And I certainly embraced the illusion that bribery had no victims. In fact, worse than that, I thought of it as a win-win at the front lines. I definitely, at the time, embraced an ethical unawareness about the consequences of bribery. And we only have to look at Transparency International's website to understand that bribery victimizes entire societies. But at the field level, I wasn't so enlightened. So Jane, to go back to your what were you thinking when you got caught moments, when I was caught by my former employer, I was thinking, I've got 2 children, a big house, a few cars, and a very, large burn rate from a cash flow perspective. I needed to find work. Sitting across the desk from a fraud prosecutor and FBI agents, I'm thinking, what have I done? My life has taken a course that I really never imagined. And through the unique experience that a proffer offers, I used that initial experience where I proffered with the Justice Department as an opportunity to really change the trajectory of my life and turn it around, knowing that some harsh consequences might lie ahead.
It's interesting. One of the issues that has come up, as I know that you're aware, is of course there's now a lot more international cooperation between a lot of the investigative authorities. So they've now got the International Foreign Bribery Task Force, which comprises representatives of the Australian Federal Police, the FBI, the City of London Police, and the RCMP in Canada. But at the time when you were being investigated, of course, those formal structures were not in place. But from what I understand, or from what you were saying, there was still quite a lot of cooperation between the UK and US authorities. How did that play out in terms of the practical consequences for you?
Well, there were 2 components of that, Jane, and it's not something that was frequently reported with respect to my case, is that on the one hand, I was cooperating with the International Anti-Corruption Unit for the City of London Police. A number of the different, I won't use the word targets, but many of the people that crossed my path while I was cooperating covertly with the FBI were from the United Kingdom. That led to covert cooperation with the City of London Police. So, I've been in situations where I have law enforcement agents from the US and the UK monitoring, my conversations, monitoring my meetings while I was operating in the United Kingdom. So the teeth of international law enforcement cooperation, and now we're going back to 2008 and 2009, where some of those efforts were probably first getting started, but without revealing the specifics, I can just assure you they were quite sophisticated. And at the same time, I was facing what is often written as carbon copy prosecutions, in that I also became the target of an investigation by HMRC, Revenue and Customs, and the Crown Prosecution Service. So while on the one hand I was cooperating, on the other hand, I was also working with UK prosecutorial resources and the Department of Justice in order to come to some sort of resolution to potential prosecution in the UK. Ultimately, that was resolved with an immunity from prosecution agreement with the Crown Prosecution Service. So for one person, it was an enormously complicated situation. And as you shared today, things have gotten much more sophisticated Those formal law enforcement ties are much tighter now than they were then, but I can assure you they were quite real even back in 2008.
Richard, as a consequence, although you reached an arrangement with the UK authorities, you ultimately spent 14 months in jail in the US and are currently still on parole. You mentioned during the boardroom lunch the profound impact that had on you and your family. So where to next? What's your next move now, Richard?
Well, Jane, I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, 14 and a half months away from family, not being there when my son was applying to college and when my daughter was applying to grad school, that's difficult. You can't be a father with 300, phone minutes a month and delayed emails. It just, it doesn't work. So I got home in December of 2013 and switched on my computer, Jane, and I started looking at what's going on in compliance. Interestingly enough, Jane, when I was a government witness in a number of trials in the US, in order not to prejudice my testimony, I was not allowed to read news about FCPA enforcements, FCPA trials. So I was really sort of in a time freeze as to what was going on, and certainly remained that way while I was in prison. So I get home and I start to look at what went on. And I noticed that the field of anti-bribery compliance, as I'm sure you well know, was quite robust from the perspectives of the law, of audit, investigations, regulatory perspectives, and then, of course, sort of general contractors. But Jane, what I noticed is there was not any analysis or understanding of what was it like at the front lines. What are well-educated, well-compensated people like myself thinking about when they risk their own liberty far away from the C-suites in very remote offices? So the distance between where anti-bribery compliance originates and where it hits the sharp end couldn't be further in terms of the distance between two points. But no one was really addressing how this all impacts those at the field, those that confront corruption risk, especially in high-risk areas. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to share what it was like. I will share my rationalizations, the distortions, the illusions, and to see if it might bring any value to compliance practitioners who really want to make compliance work at the front lines. As someone shared with me at a recent oil and gas symposium, she said, I know that I have robust compliance to where the regulators would probably be satisfied if they looked at it. She said, but what keeps me up at night is, does it really get understood at the field level? And not that I'm claiming to be a union rep of people who reside in the sales force in these areas, but I think I do have a responsibility also from a deterrence value to share this experience, because these are real-world crimes with real-world consequences, and it is a struggle. It's just not as simple as yes or no when you're looking at your bonus, when you're looking at incentives, when you're looking at forecasts, and you're facing, highly corrupt regions. It can sometimes be a zero-sum game at the front line where someone says, what does management really want? Compliance or sales, because I can't deliver both. And when you have people putting compliance decisions into their own hands at the front lines, I think that's peril for everybody. So that's sort of what I'm doing now. I'm just raising my voice, sharing the experience, and where it brings value to help sort of align these spoken and unspoken messages of incentives and compliance. I'm happy to share my viewpoint.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Jane. It's nice to chat with you again, and good luck with your move in London.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon.